So we've been exploring the fascinating depths of collective representation and Freud, particularly how those ideas played out in the Durkheimian school. But let's be honest, when we talk about Durkheim and religion, elementary forms of the religious life often gets presented as the final word, the neat package deal. However, if we peel back that layer, things get much more interesting. It turns out there's a whole subterranean current within the Durkheimian tradition, a kind of renegade Durkheimianism, largely focused on one crucial, yet often overlooked, aspect, the nature of the sacred itself. So, Durkheim kicks off his analysis of religion by saying it's all about setting aside and protecting sacred things. Makes sense, right? But then comes the classic sociological headache. How do you define this sacred thing without just pointing back at itself? You can easily say the profane is just whatever isn't sacred. A negative definition works fine. But trying to define the sacred as simply non-profane? That's circular and frankly doesn't cut it because the sacred is supposed to be the bedrock of his entire theory. What makes something sacred? Why does it inspire awe? And is this quality uniform across all sacred things? This is where the plot thickens. This is where Durkheim, borrowing heavily from Robertson Smith, introduces a really juicy twist. He argues that the sacred isn't just one monolithic block opposed to the profane. Oh no, the sacred itself has two faces. Think of it like this. You have the right sacred, the pure, good stuff, the stuff that keeps society humming, maintains health, order, the totem animal, the sun god, the protective spirit. But then, lurking alongside it, is the left sacred. This is the impure, the transgressive, the potentially dangerous side. It's associated with taboo, impurity, disease, death, things that threaten the social fabric. Interestingly, the word sacred itself carries this duality. Look at Latin sacer, it means both holy and accursed. The French sacré still does double duty. Think sacred music versus a damned liar. Our English word sacred kind of lost that second shade, which might explain some of our own potential blind spots when reading Durkheim. Now, here's where it gets really tangled, even for Durkheim. These two poles, the pure and the impure sacred, aren't always neatly separated. They can bleed into each other depending on the context, what he calls exterior circumstances. Take a corpse, for example. In many societies, it starts as an impure sacred object, something feared, associated with contagion and death. But through specific rituals, it can transform into a venerated, even beneficial sacred object, sometimes even being consumed by relatives as a source of protection. So are they two distinct states, or just two sides of the same coin constantly shifting? Durkheim himself seems a bit torn. He acknowledges the difficulty in drawing a clean line between the reverence we feel for the pure sacred and the fear or horror we feel before the impure. Does intense piety ever carry a whiff of dread? And does facing something truly terrifying, like the most potent impure sacred force, doesn't that sometimes evoke a strange kind of awe or respect? The lines blur. Given this ambiguity, Durkheim tends to lean heavily on the positive side of the equation. He distinguishes between negative rites, basically rules against doing things, keeping the profane and sacred separate, and positive rites, which are the actions that actually bring people into contact with the sacred, generating that famous collective effervescence. Now logically, you'd assume these positive rites are tapping into the pure life-affirming sacred, right? The one that brings people together and revitalizes society. And Durkheim certainly suggests this. But here's the kicker. He never really satisfactorily explains why society would bother creating this impure sacred force, the one linked to taboo, transgression, and potential destruction. If the sacred ultimately comes from society to strengthen it, why cultivate a part that seems inherently threatening? Durkheim doesn't give us a clear answer. It's like noticing a powerful engine but wondering why the car also has a built-in self-destruct sequence. So, while Durkheim lays the groundwork, it's really his protege, Mauss, Hubert, and Hertz, who really dive headfirst into the murky waters of the impure or left sacred. They don't just acknowledge it, they make it central. Why? Because they see it as more than just a footnote. It's a fundamental aspect of the system that needs its own explanation, not just treated as a lesser version of the pure sacred. Part of this shift likely comes from their deep dives into Indian religious traditions, where these transgressive elements often hold much more prominent roles than in the Judeo-Christian traditions. Durkheim knew better. Think Gnosticism versus Tantra, both involve figures who transcend normal moral codes. But Tantra became a significant historical force, whereas Gnosticism was largely suppressed. But again, it's deeper than just different research topics. It's a genuine theoretical pivot. These three thinkers also pushed back against Durkheim's framework in other ways. Mauss and Hubert, for instance, felt the concept of the sacred was too narrow. They proposed a broader term, mana, to capture the underlying power they saw in both magic and religion. Think of it as the raw spiritual energy that fuels both systems. Hubert, in particular, took aim at Durkheim's focus on established churches and the pure sacred. He argued this ignored the vast history of popular beliefs and practices, and crucially, he saw magic and religion not as separate boxes, but as interacting forces, like crime and law within a larger social system. Hertz, meanwhile, directly tackled the impure sacred in his work on death rituals, showing how the newly deceased could move from a state of impure sacredness, inspiring horror and exclusion, to a pure sacred status, integrating them back into the community. This wasn't just about being non-sacred. It was about navigating the complex social dynamics of impurity. Mauss's work on the gift is another prime example. He introduced the Maori concept of Hao, the spirit of things, to explain the power of gifts. Objects aren't inert, they have a spiritual essence that binds giver and receiver, creating obligations to give, receive, and return. Accepting a gift is like accepting a piece of the giver's soul, making retention dangerous. Now Levi-Strauss, ever the structuralist, wasn't having it. He famously criticized Mauss for falling into the ethnographer's trap of taking local explanations literally. For Levi-Strauss, how wasn't the real reason behind exchange. It was just the conscious story people told themselves about an underlying unconscious logic, something more universal and structural. But Mauss had a different goal. He wanted an inclusive theory, one that could account for the wild, competitive, almost warlike aspects of gift-giving seen in potlatches, things that didn't fit neatly into a purely rational or moralistic model. He needed Hao to capture that untidiness. Robert Hertz really brought the impure sacred into sharp focus, especially in his study of death rituals among Indonesian peoples. He described a fascinating process involving two burials. Initially, the corpse is treated as an impure sacred object, a source of dread and potential contamination, leading to the relatives being temporarily excluded from the community. Only after a period of time and further rituals does the corpse transition to a pure sacred status, allowing reintegration. Notice this isn't just about moving from profane to sacred. The whole affair, the horror, the impurity, the eventual veneration, remains deeply embedded within the social structure. Hertz showed how this impure, sacred dimension isn't marginal. It's woven into the very fabric of social life, creating spaces of ambiguity and exerting a powerful generative force at the heart of the community. This focus on the impure sacred doesn't just stay in academic circles. It opens up different political and cultural paths compared to sticking with the pure sacred. Think about it. Emphasizing the pure sacred leads to a kind of classic Durkheimian progressivism, rational, reformist, aiming to improve society through understanding its moral foundations. There's a clear separation between scientific analysis and political action, and the intellectual's personal feelings are kept somewhat aside. But focus on the impure sacred. That opens the door to something different. It leans into the emotional intensity, the transgressive energy, the collective effervescence that can be disruptive. Here, the line between analyzing society and actively participating in it blurs. The intellectual's own existential situation, their personal engagement with these powerful, sometimes terrifying forces, becomes much more central to their political role. As Alan Stokel puts it, thinking about the French intellectual tradition, this tension between the writer rational argument and the author the power of language itself finds its roots here, in how Durkheim himself presented the sacred as both rational and pre-rational. Now let's zoom in on the interwar period in France. This was a time of immense crisis, the devastation of World War I, the perceived failures of the secular Republican government, and a general sense of malaise. The dominant, institutionalized Durkheimian thought, representing the old guard, lost significant ground. Many intellectuals, reacting against what they saw as the lifeless excesses of democracy and reason, looked elsewhere. We saw waves of Catholic conversions, but also a fascination with anti-democratic movements, the avant-garde, and a resurgence of mysticism. Nietzsche's ideas, particularly his call for self-overcoming and embracing life's tragic dimensions, resonated strongly. And guess who became a key figure for many of these younger, restless minds? Not Durkheim, but his former student Marcel Mauss. Mauss, with his warmer personality and his focus on the impure sacred, resonated with a new generation of ethnologists, artists, and writers who felt alienated from the mainstream university world and were drawn to the transgressive and the mystical. Out of this milieu emerged Georges Bataille, Roger Caillois, and Michel Leiris, forming the Collège de Sociologie in 1937. Their ambition was audacious, to create a sacred sociology. This wasn't just about studying the sacred, it was about actively engaging with it, trying to construct direct experiences of the sacred within their group. They rejected the traditional split between the detached sociologist, observing the social world, and the participant experiencing it. Instead, they aimed to be both analyst and actor, a moral community conducting sociological experiments on themselves and potentially others. Think of it as taking the insights from Mauss, Hubert, and Hertz about the impure sacred and running with them, infusing them with the radical aesthetics and political fervor of the surrealists and other avant-garde groups. Bataille had even founded a more secret precursor group, Acephale, earlier, already experimenting with these transgressive, quasi-religious ideas. Bataille's thinking revolves around this idea of expenditure. Forget production as the primary driver of society. For Bataille, it's expenditure, the giving away, the destruction, the sacrifice of surplus energy or goods. He identified what he called la part maudite, the accursed share, the excess that must be ritually spent or destroyed in moments of intense social energy, like sacrifice, war, festivals, or sexual orgies. This completely flips the script on traditional economics and sociology. Where others saw production as key, Bataille saw expenditure as fundamental. He was heavily influenced by Kojève's interpretation of Hegel, which emphasized desire's fulfillment only through radical action and destruction, and by Nietzsche's critique of morality and embrace of transgression. Crucially, Bataille, like Mauss, Hubert, and Hertz before him, insisted that these experiences couldn't be studied objectively from afar. The sacred, especially in its impure, transgressive form, is fundamentally personal, implicating the observer directly. It's not just data, it's lived experience. Roger Caillois, the only one of the three core members who actually studied under Mauss, produced work deeply rooted in this tradition. His books on myth and man and the sacred are clearly indebted to Mauss and Durkheim, exploring the foundational role of mythical thought. But Caillois also clearly shows the trajectory towards emphasizing the transgressive, the impure sacred. He explicitly discussed the connection between sexuality and the sacred, a theme that would later become central to Bataille's work. Caillois seems to represent a bridge, carrying forward the Durkheimian insights, particularly the Martian ones, while pushing further towards acknowledging the power and necessity of the impure dimension. Michel Leiris brought a deeply personal, reflexive dimension to the group. His famous paper, The Sacred in Daily Life, was groundbreaking. He didn't just analyze sacredness in others, he analyzed how it was constructed in his own childhood and how that structure continued to shape his adult life. He drew explicit distinctions between the pure sacred objects of respect, like his father's hat and revolver, and the impure sacred zones of transgression, like the bathroom or a nearby racecourse. This blend of rigorous ethnographic method applied to the self, combined with surrealist introspection, became characteristic of his work. He aimed for what he called engaged literature, where the writer becomes the total man, blurring the lines between real and imaginary, using the tools of the ethnographer to map the sacred landscape within himself. And this legacy of the impure sacred didn't just fade away. Thinkers like Foucault, Derrida, and Baudrillard clearly drew upon these currents. Foucault, fascinated by Bataille, saw connections between transgressive experiences like madness or sexuality and the very act of writing itself as a way to encounter the sacred. He critiqued how modern normalization and discipline suppress these vital disruptive energies. Derrida, directly engaging with Mauss on the gift, used his deconstructionist method to expose the instability of binary oppositions, revealing hidden transgressions and ambiguities, much like the impure sacred challenges the pure. He saw Bataille's work in Artaud's theater as embracing this radical potential. And Baudrillard, reacting against productivist sociology, argued that the sacred wasn't dead but transformed, finding expression in modern spectacle, mass events like soccer matches, and even terrorism. He developed the concept of seduction as a form of agonistic, transgressive exchange, echoing the potlatch and sacrifice in its destructive creativity. So, what's the takeaway? This focus on the impure, transgressive sacred, initially explored by Mauss, Hubert, and Hertz as a counterpoint to Durkheim's emphasis, proved remarkably resilient. It didn't just die with the original school, it found new life in post-structuralist thought. By keeping the body, sexuality, and transgression in play, it helped move beyond the idealism sometimes associated with the pure sacred focus. Perhaps most importantly, it offers a powerful challenge to the narrative that sacredness inevitably fades in modernity. Instead, it suggests we need a richer, more holistic understanding of the sacred, one that embraces its complexities, its potential darkness, and its enduring relevance, especially when faced with the crises of our own time. It's a reminder that the full story of the sacred is rarely just about purity and light.